Why being a Victorian widow sucked more than losing your husband. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to the 19th century, to the world of black crepe, drawn curtains, and a truly exhausting amount of social guilt. So if you're settled in under your blanket, eyes half-lidded, maybe sipping something warm and faintly judgmental, let's wander through the dim and dusty corridors of Victorian mourning. A time when grief wasn't just an emotion. It was an occupation. Because in the 1800s, losing your husband wasn't the end of your suffering. It was, in fact, only the beginning. Tonight's story isn't about love or loss. It's about etiquette, hypocrisy, and the fact that the Victorians could turn even sadness into a bureaucratic nightmare. So, take a deep breath. We're going to drift slowly through the quiet gloom of the Victorian widow's world. A place where the teacups were black. The curtains stayed closed, and everyone was very, very concerned about how long you planned to cry. The death business. Let's start with something the Victorians were disturbingly good at. Death. They industrialized it, commercialized it, and turned it into an art form. There were catalogs for mourning clothes, special menus for funerary luncheons, and even paid mourners. People you could literally hire to cry for you, which, depending on your family, might have been a better deal than inviting your actual relatives. By the mid-19th century, an entire economy existed around grief. There were mourning jewelers who specialized in black enamel lockets containing tiny braids of hair from your deceased loved one. Because nothing says romance like wearing someone's scalp as an accessory. Funeral directors became a legitimate profession. Before that, it was usually just the local carpenter who handled coffins on the side. But now, you had licensed experts who offered full-service mourning packages, including hearses, veils, embalming, and, if you were particularly posh, matching black horses with velvet harnesses. Mourning wasn't a private affair. It was a performance, and everyone was watching. Enter the widow now. In this culture of performative sadness, no one suffered more, or was expected to appear to suffer more, than the widow. For a Victorian woman, losing her husband wasn't just emotional devastation, it was a social transformation. She went from being Mrs. So-and-so to a kind of half-ghost, visible, but not really alive in society anymore. Immediately after the funeral, the widow was plunged into what was called deep mourning. And deep mourning wasn't just a poetic phrase, it was a legally recognized, socially enforced phase of life, complete with dress codes, behavioral rules, and an invisible timer that everyone else seemed to have memorized. For the first year and a day, yes, a day, because of course they added that, she had to wear nothing but black. Not just any black, either, not silk, not satin. It had to be matte black crepe, a fabric so dull it made shadows look festive. Crepe was rough, scratchy, and prone to catching dust, making widows look both funereal and perpetually unlaundered. No jewelry, no lace, no social visits, except to close relatives. You couldn't attend parties, you couldn't dance, and heaven forbid you laugh too loudly in public. If you did, someone was bound to remark, "She doesn't seem to feel it much, does she?" Because in Victorian society, the most important thing wasn't that you felt grief. It was that you looked like you did. The mourning wardrobe. Victorians loved rules, and nowhere were those rules more obsessively detailed than in the etiquette of mourning. Fashion magazines of the time, like the Queen and Cassell's Household Guide, published entire columns explaining exactly what widows were allowed to wear at each stage of grief. Deep mourning. All black. No exceptions. Second mourning. Black with dull gray or lavender trim. A daring touch for the emotionally adventurous. Half mourning. You could finally wear mauve, lilac, or white, signaling to the world that you were nearly done grieving, but not quite ready for joy. The transition from black to gray to purple wasn't just symbolic, it was scheduled. Move too fast, and people whispered. Move too slow, and they pitied you for clinging. It was like emotional project management, but with more veils. And speaking of veils, the widow's veil was perhaps the most cursed invention of them all. Made of heavy black crepe netting, it completely covered the face, trailing almost to the waist. It blocked light, obscured vision, and made it nearly impossible to breathe in warm weather. One etiquette manual gently advised women not to walk too close to open flames while wearing it, as it was highly combustible. So, in addition to grief, widows lived with the constant risk of spontaneous combustion, which feels like the perfect metaphor for Victorian womanhood. Really, the smell of sadness mourning had a scent. Too, crepe fabric gave off a distinctive odor, a mix of starch, dye, and industrial chemicals. That was both suffocating and unmistakable. Walking into a Victorian funeral parlor was like stepping into a perfumed swamp of sadness and mildew, and if the crepe smell didn't announce your grief, the perfume did. Widows often wore violet or heliotrope oil, soft floral scents associated with sorrow. Some even dabbed on mourning cologne, a light, melancholic fragrance meant to smell, apparently, like dignity and despair. Because if you couldn't afford to show grief with diamonds or horses, you could at least smell like it. The etiquette of suffering. Now, you might think that after all this, the veil, the crepe, the rules, society, would take pity on widows. But no, Victorian culture managed to turn widowhood into both a moral test and a spectator sport. There were rules about how you were allowed to speak, about your husband, too much praise, and you were accused of sentimental vanity. Too little, and people assumed you'd hated him. If you remarried too quickly, you were shallow. If you didn't remarry, you were tragic, or possibly suspicious. Some women used the rules to their advantage, though. A widow could, in some ways, gain a degree of social independence, a rare luxury for women of the time. Freed from her husband's authority, she could inherit property, manage finances, and even live alone, all while maintaining a convenient moral shield of respectable grief. Queen Victoria herself made widowhood into an art form. When Prince Albert died in 1861, she plunged the entire nation into mourning for decades. She wore black for the rest of her life, 40 years of it, and expected everyone else to follow suit. Entire generations of Britons grew up thinking black was simply the default color of adulthood. Victoria's devotion was framed as romantic, but it also reinforced an impossible ideal: the eternal widow, frozen in time, her entire identity defined by someone else's absence. Mourning as industry, it's easy to forget that all this grief came with receipts. The mourning trade was one of the most profitable sectors of the Victorian economy. Tailors specialized in mourning wear for all occasions. Milliners made veils, bonnets and gloves in seasonal shades of black. Stationers sold black-edged writing paper for sorrowful correspondence. Even dinnerware came in mourning sets. Black-trimmed teacups for those who wanted to sip their tea with a tasteful dash of misery. For the poor, it was a different story. You couldn't afford custom crepe, so you dyed your regular clothes, black using soot or cheap ink. This left you smelling like a chimney and turning everything you touched vaguely gray. But it was better than showing up to a funeral in color. That would have been considered almost criminal. The hypocrisy was staggering. The wealthy wore grief as fashion. The poor struggled just to make it look convincing. The widows, isolation as the months dragged on. The widow's social world shrank. Friends stopped visiting, not out of cruelty, but because no one knew what to say. Invitations stopped coming. Laughter, music, and light were all quietly banned. Even the home changed. Mirrors were draped in black cloth to prevent the spirit of the dead from being trapped inside. Clocks were stopped at the hour of death. Curtains stayed closed for weeks, making the house a permanent twilight zone of grief. Meals were quiet. Conversation was minimal. It was as if life itself had politely stepped aside. Widows were expected to accept all this with dignity and grace. Tears were permitted, but only the elegant kind. Loud sobbing was for the lower classes. A proper lady's grief was silent, composed, and thoroughly exhausting. The temptation of freedom, and yet, under all that black lace and propriety, something else occasionally stirred. For some widows, this strange social exile was the first real freedom they'd ever had. No husband, no supervision, no one to tell them what they could or couldn't do, as long as they pretended not to enjoy it. There are records of widows quietly taking up new hobbies, running businesses, or traveling alone for the first time in their lives. A few even began secret affairs. Because when you're dressed like death itself, you tend to be left alone. In the privacy of her widowhood, A woman could think, act, and decide things for herself. It wasn't liberation exactly, but it was the faint outline of it, a soft rebellion, wrapped in black crepe. The end of mourning. Eventually, after 2 years or so, the widow could emerge from her cocoon of sorrow. She might replace her black wardrobe with shades of lilac or gray. She could attend small dinners again, maybe even smile in public. Society would sigh in relief. Finally, she was herself again, as though grief were something you simply clocked out of. The quiet widowhoods of the forgotten noblewomen. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of medieval history. Not the grand battles, not the knights in shining armor, but the silence that came after. Specifically, we're talking about what happened to the wives of fallen knights, the women who were left behind when the banners came home bloodied, and their husbands didn't. So go ahead and settle in. Dim the lights, find a comfortable spot, and let's wander slowly through the ghostly corridors of medieval widowhood, because for every knight who rode gallantly into battle, there was usually someone sitting in a chilly manor house waiting for news, and hoping, perhaps irrationally, that her husband hadn't been trampled by a horse belonging to a duke with a grudge. The chivalric aftermath. It's easy to forget that. Knighthood was not a particularly sustainable career path. By the 13th century, Europe's battlefields were basically open-air meat grinders for the upper classes. When knights died, and they often did, their wives were suddenly adrift in a legal system that was both obsessed with land ownership and remarkably uninterested in the emotional welfare of women. A widow might have spent years managing her husband's estates, bearing his children, and hosting the occasional feast where everyone politely ignored the smell of mud and wet dogs. And then suddenly, she was the dowager, which sounds elegant, but in practice it meant woman whose fate will now be decided by whichever man is most politically convenient. The legal position of widows. Congratulations, you are now property. Under medieval law, a knight's wife did not simply become a free agent upon his death. Far from it. Her life instantly turned into a small-scale legal battle, often with the crown itself. The land her husband held was usually part of a feudal contract, so if he died, technically the property reverted to his lord, unless the widow could prove her right to a dower. 1/3 of the estate's income for her lifetime. Of course, that required documentation, witnesses, and, ideally, male relatives who weren't also dead. And in an era when people thought record-keeping meant maybe someone remembers this, widows were at a disadvantage. Many were promptly remarried, often without much say in the matter, because their estates were valuable bargaining chips. A young, rich widow was basically the medieval equivalent of a lucrative business merger waiting to happen. Oh, a business deal in a vale, you might think a woman would have some time to grieve. Not really. Royal and noble administrators worked quickly. For instance, After the Battle of Crécy in 1346, that charming episode where English longbows turned French knights into pincushions, a flurry of widowhoods erupted overnight. Within weeks, royal clerks were cataloguing which widows were available for new marriages. This wasn't romance, it was logistics. Widow with a castle or a valuable manor could be married off to reward a loyal retainer, sometimes even to someone much younger, because nothing says strategic alliance quite like a grieving 30-year-old being married to a 17-year-old squire who just learned how to read. The Crown's involvement: widows for rent in England. Widows of knights who held land in chief, meaning directly from the king, technically became wards of the crown. That meant the king could sell or grant their remarriage rights to whoever paid for them. Yes, remarriage rights were literally sold. You could buy the right to marry a particular widow, or simply to choose her next husband. Sort of royal matchmaking monopoly. Some women paid themselves for their own freedom, a grimly poetic act known as purchasing the right to remain single. One widow of a Lincolnshire knight paid 40 marks, roughly enough to buy several dozen cows, just to be left alone, which, honestly, sounds like a fair deal. Emotional realities. Mourning as a political performance. Now, we don't have diaries filled with heartfelt grief from most medieval widows. Paper was expensive, and emotional honesty was not a currency the nobility liked to spend publicly. But we do know that mourning was, in itself, a kind of performance. The length and style of mourning clothing often reflected not sorrow, but status. The wealthier the widow, the longer she might dress in somber black. Not necessarily because she missed her husband, but because she could afford to. Meanwhile, poor or middling widows had to move on quickly, economically. They couldn't afford a long emotional intermission. Fields still needed managing. Servants still needed paying. Life did not pause for grief. It just quietly reshuffled its priorities. Let's drift to France for a moment. Across the Channel, things were not dramatically better. In late medieval France, widows technically had certain protections under coutume, local customary law, but these varied wildly by region. In some provinces, a widow could retain her late husband's lands until she remarried. In others, she was expected to vacate immediately so the heir, often her own underage son, could take possession. And of course, every cousin, uncle, and neighbor, with a half-baked genealogical claim would appear like mushrooms after rain. Many widows ended up negotiating for their own survival, literally sitting down at long oak tables with hostile relatives and arguing about acreage. Imagine that. The candles flickering, the smell of damp wool in the air, and some pompous cousin insisting that your kitchen garden technically belongs to him because of feudal right of tenure. The monastic escape. Some women, understandably, opted out of this nonsense. A convent offered refuge. It was, in a sense, a socially acceptable way to vanish. A widow could donate her dowry or a portion of her lands to a religious house, and retire into a life of prayer, embroidery, and occasional gossip about the bishop's new ring. This was not always an act of devotion. For many, it was a quiet act of self-preservation. Within convent walls, a widow could regain a degree of control over her routine, her correspondence, even her own possessions, and she was less likely to be used as a pawn in someone else's marital chess game. Some noble widows became abbesses, powerful, respected figures in their own right. A few even ruled convents larger and wealthier than some towns. So, while the secular world treated widows as loose property, the religious sphere offered a rare, if austere, form of independence. Widow as landlord, but not every widow. Retreated to prayer and incense, many stayed exactly where they were and ran the estates themselves. Records from manorial rolls show widows collecting rents, overseeing harvests, and managing household accounts with brisk efficiency. A surprising number of these estates actually improved under female management, probably because widows were less inclined to waste the grain supply on tournaments and hunting trips. 1. Chronicler in 14th century Yorkshire noted that a certain Lady Agnes ruled her manors with greater wisdom than her late husband ever did, which is polite medieval shorthand for he was terrible at it. In some cases, these women became local fixtures, respected, feared, and occasionally accused of witchcraft, because apparently competence was suspicious. War widows and survival. During prolonged conflicts like the 100 Years' War, widowhood became practically an occupation. Some noble families had 3 or 4 successive widows managing estates, while the men systematically perished in France. This constant turnover reshaped the social fabric in certain regions. Widows effectively became the backbone of local governance, and yet history rarely mentions them by name. They appear in charters as the Lady of X or Widow of so-and-so, but not as individuals. Their lives were recorded in ink that fades fast. Still, every now and then, a letter or legal document lets one of them speak, briefly, practically, and with remarkable clarity. A glimpse from the past. Lady Marjorie's letter 1, such woman was Marjorie de la Beche, a 14th century English widow whose husband had been killed while serving abroad. In her surviving letters, she requests permission to remain in her manor for the sustenance of her household and the keeping of her children. It's not a plea, it's a statement of fact. Her tone is brisk, the kind of tone used by someone who has already endured several rounds of bureaucracy and is no longer impressed by it. Her request was granted, and for the next 20 years, Marjorie managed her lands independently, defending them against both opportunistic relatives and the occasional overconfident sheriff. She was, by all accounts, formidable, and her story, though brief, hints at thousands like it. Women who, for all their lack of formal power, quietly kept medieval society running between wars. Widowhood as identity in later centuries. Widowhood became almost an aesthetic. By the 15th century, Certain noble widows adopted distinct black veils and austere gowns that became instantly recognizable symbols of dignity. Some were genuinely devout. Others were cultivating a brand. Being a widow could convey authority. It meant maturity, independence, and, most importantly, exemption from the marital circus. A widow could host, negotiate, and correspond freely, without the oversight of a husband. In a society that allowed women few official roles, widowhood was paradoxically one of the most powerful. Still, for every well-documented case of a successful widow, there are countless others who vanished quietly. Estates absorbed, names forgotten, tombstones left unmarked. The medieval world wasn't designed to remember women who simply endured. A world without deodorant. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before showers, before soap as we know it, before plumbing, before the mysterious modern luxury known as antiperspirant. We're going back to the Middle Ages to find out what people actually smelled like. Now, this might not sound like the most glamorous historical adventure, but smell, in many ways, was the invisible heartbeat of the medieval world. Everyone lived in a cloud of it. You could tell what someone did for a living, what class they belonged to, sometimes even what they'd eaten for breakfast, all without them saying a word. So, settle in, dim the lights, take a deep breath, preferably of something pleasant, and let's drift back about 800 years, to a Europe where everything and everyone had a very particular aroma. Let's start with something comforting. People in the Middle Ages did wash, just not in the way we would call washing. They didn't step into tiled bathrooms or run steamy showers. They didn't even necessarily use soap on their bodies very often, but they were not, as Victorian-era writers later like to imagine, wandering around coated in centuries of grime and despair. No, they cleaned themselves using what they had: water, linen, and a remarkable tolerance for things we would now call unacceptable. A typical morning for a medieval noblewoman might begin with a basin of water and a soft cloth, called a towel in period sources, though really it was more of an all-purpose rag. She'd dip it in the water and gently wipe her face, hands, maybe her neck and arms. That was it. A kind of symbolic bathing. Just enough to feel fresh-ish without making a fuss about it. And if she was very fancy, the water might be lightly scented with rose petals, herbs, or a few drops of something expensive like lavender oil. Because if you couldn't actually be clean, you could at least smell like you were trying. Medieval people loved good smells. They just had trouble producing them. So instead, they surrounded themselves with aromatic distractions, pomanders, filled with spices, bags of herbs sewn into clothing, gloves soaked in orange blossom water. Wealthy men might carry sweet bags in their sleeves. Women might keep perfumed beads around their necks. It was an entire culture built around pretending smell away. Because the truth was, no matter what you did, you were never entirely free. From the daily symphony of humanity, sweat, smoke, damp wool, candle wax, and just the faintest hint of manure carried on the breeze. Now, about soap. Yes, medieval people had it. They just didn't particularly trust it. Soap was made from animal fat and lye, a caustic combination that worked well for laundry and floors, but not so much for human skin. If you washed with it too often, it left you dry, itchy, and vaguely flammable. So most people saved soap for their hands and clothing, and relied instead on plain water, herbs, or vinegar for the rest of their hygiene. Interestingly, there were medieval bathhouses. Lots of them. In many towns, public baths were social hubs, half spa, half gossip club. Some were luxurious, with scented oils and heated pools. Others were less reputable. Think dimly lit rooms full of warm water, questionable company, and an ambiance best described as moistly medieval. By the 13th century, some cities like Paris had dozens of public baths. Men and women even bathed together in certain places, at least until the church began to have opinions about that, which, of course, it did. But, if we're honest, the average medieval person's relationship to water was cautious. Doctors often warned against full bathing. The belief, popular from ancient Rome through the 17th century, was that water opened your pores and let in disease. So washing too much wasn't just frivolous, it was dangerous. You could cleanse the surface, yes, but don't let the water in. This created a strange paradox. People who could afford baths often didn't take them. Meanwhile, the poor, who had no access to heated rooms or perfumed towels, washed in rivers whenever they could, which was both unsanctioned and unsanitary. So cleanliness, as a concept, became less about being clean and more about not smelling bad enough to offend important people. And speaking of smell, we have to talk about what everything else smelled like, because even if you washed daily and doused yourself in lavender water, you were still surrounded by the unmistakable perfume of medieval life, rotting food, animal dung, wood smoke, sweat, and the constant lingering tang of chamber pots. Cities were fragrant. Imagine narrow streets lined with open drains, piles of refuse, and stray dogs enthusiastically assisting with sanitation. Now add 1,000. Chimneys burning damp wood, a few dozen tanneries boiling animal hides, and a marketplace where every third stall is selling fish that really should have been sold yesterday. Welcome to Paris, circa 1350. The smell wasn't a detail of medieval life. It was medieval life. Even royal palaces weren't immune. The French court at the Louvre, before it became an art museum, was notorious for its filth. Chroniclers complained about human waste being dumped into the Seine from the upper floors. The English court wasn't much better. One 14th century account describes how the servants at Westminster Palace simply threw kitchen scraps out the nearest window, which, incidentally, overlooked the Thames. Londoners of the time joked that if you fell into the river, you'd come out cleaner, but probably dead. Of course, not everyone was content to live in this fragrant democracy. The upper classes worked hard to rise above the stench, or at least above the people producing it. Royalty built private chambers with their own lavatories. Essentially, wooden seats over chutes that dropped waste into cesspits. The pits were emptied, eventually, by unlucky workers known as gong farmers. Their job description was simple: remove centuries of human waste by hand. Usually at night, for obvious reasons, and yes, they were paid well. Danger money, really, not because of the filth, but because cesspits sometimes emitted enough methane to catch fire. There are recorded cases of latrine explosions. History, as always, finds new ways to make us grateful for plumbing. Now, we might assume that people simply became used to it, that their noses tuned out the constant smell of decay. And to some extent, that's true. But medieval sources show they were obsessed with scent. They noticed it, judged it, moralized about it. To smell good was to be good. To smell bad was to be sinful, diseased, or poor. Priests compared the odor of holiness to roses and myrrh. Chroniclers described evil rulers as literally stinking of corruption. It wasn't metaphorical, they meant it. So people took smell seriously. They just approached it symbolically rather than scientifically. Let's float now into a typical medieval street. You're walking down a narrow lane in a market town. Perhaps York or Bruges. The air is thick with the mingled scents of baking bread, horse manure, tallow candles, and someone boiling cabbage. There's also, faintly, the sweet rot of apples from a nearby stall. A woman tosses dishwater into the gutter, where it joins a slow-moving stream of something you'd rather not identify. A butcher's boy carries a bucket of blood. A monk passes by, smelling faintly of beeswax and damp wool, and no one, not a single person, finds this unusual, because this is normal. This is how life is. The modern idea of deodorizing, of eliminating smell entirely, simply didn't exist. You could mask odor, balance it, even sanctify it. But erasing it? Impossible. The medieval nose was simply more forgiving. At the top of the social ladder, of course, you could afford to smell expensively human. Perfume was big business, especially for those who could import ingredients from the East. Ambergris, civet, musk, sandalwood. These were exotic, powerful scents extracted from things like whale intestines and the glands of small, angry cats. Kings and queens wore them lavishly, both to impress and to disguise the smell of the less fortunate milling around their courts. Queen Elizabeth III, admittedly more early modern than medieval, was known to own hundreds of pairs of perfumed gloves. Catherine de' Medici had her own perfume maker. So by the late Middle Ages, smell had become a class marker. If you reeked of animal fat, you were poor. If you reeked of ambergris, you were royal. Let's take a moment, though, for sympathy. Even if you were a medieval noble with the best access to perfumed water and linen towels, your environment still worked against you. Your castles were drafty. Your candles smoked. Your clothes were made of wool and lined with fur, which absorbed every odor within a 10-foot radius. Laundry was rare and laborious. You didn't so much wash your clothes as air them out and occasionally beat them with sticks. And while your servants might scrub the floors with rosemary water to disguise the scent of damp stone, there was no escaping the lingering perfume of humanity. Even the air itself, smoky, heavy, unfiltered, carried the smell of fire, animals, and time. It was the smell of a world still half rural, half feral, and entirely unaware of germ theory. But here's something oddly comforting. Medieval people thought we smelled bad. When Europeans first encountered bath-loving cultures, like the Ottomans or later the Japanese, they were horrified by how often those people washed. They thought it was unnatural, even decadent, and in turn, those other cultures thought Europeans smelled like goats, which, to be fair, wasn't entirely inaccurate. How clean were the cleanest people in history? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a simpler time. A time before hot showers, scented soaps, or, frankly, the concept of personal space. You might be wrapped up warm right now, clean sheets, maybe a candle burning nearby. But for most of human history, that would have been the most luxurious bath anyone could imagine. Because tonight, we're talking about cleanliness, not the sparkling, lemon-scented kind, but the historical kind. The kind that meant you had, at some point this month, maybe washed your face with something vaguely wet. This is the story of how people, especially the wealthy and powerful, tried to stay clean, or at least look like they did. Spoiler: looks were usually the priority, so settle in, take a deep breath, and let's drift back through the centuries of soap, superstition, and royal body odor. A complicated relationship with water. We'll start with the obvious. People used to be afraid of bathing. Not all people, not all the time, but enough that it became a recurring historical theme. In medieval and early modern Europe, water was often seen as a little too intrusive. It opened the pores, they said. And through those pores, disease could slip in. So instead of washing the body, people simply changed their clothes. Yes. The logic was that clean linen drew out impurities from the skin, which sounds a bit like saying a new shirt can replace a shower. But for centuries, this was widely accepted science. So when you read that someone in the 15th century bathed often, that might just mean they owned several shirts and changed them regularly enough to seem less fragrant than the rest. The golden age of medieval bathing. That vanished. It's tempting to imagine that the Middle Ages were uniformly grimy, but actually, early medieval Europeans, particularly around the 11th to 13th centuries, were surprisingly fond of public baths. In cities like Paris, London, and Nuremberg, there were bathhouses on nearly every major street. They weren't quite Roman-style spas, but they weren't cesspools either. You could soak in hot water, get scrubbed with herbs, even enjoy a meal while half submerged. Monks were often required by their orders to bathe at least a few times a year. Nobles more often, and ordinary townsfolk made a night of it. Then things went wrong. When the Black Death arrived in the 14th century, so did a new fear, that water opened the body to infection. Bathhouses became suspect, too intimate, too unsanitary, too French, and since many of them doubled as thinly disguised brothels, moral reformers had an easy target. By the 1500s, the age of public bathing was basically gone. Europe collectively decided that the cleanest people were those who avoided water entirely. Perfume. The dry bath. So what did the cleanest people do instead? They scented themselves. Perfume became not just fashion, but hygiene. The goal wasn't to remove odor, but to replace it with something more pleasant. At the court of Louis XIV, where wigs were tall and ventilation was poor, perfume was practically structural. People sprayed it on hair, gloves, handkerchiefs, and sometimes directly onto pets, because of course they did. Louis himself bathed only occasionally. Reports suggest he preferred being sponged down with alcohol and rose water, which sounds refreshing until you imagine doing it every few months instead of daily. In fact, many aristocrats of the time claimed to bathe only on doctors' orders, and doctors, conveniently, were also afraid of water. So the 17th and 18th centuries became an olfactory arms race. The cleanest people weren't those who smelled neutral. They were the ones who smelled expensively, artificial. The medieval soap situation now, to be fair, soap did exist, but not the kind you'd want in your bathroom today. Early soaps were rough, lye-based mixtures, better suited for laundry than for skin. Medieval people used soap on clothing, linens, and occasionally their hands, but rarely on their faces or hair. A few recipes survive from monastic records. They involved animal fat, ashes, and sometimes herbs or clay for scent. If you're thinking, that sounds like something I'd use to polish armor, you're not wrong. So the cleanest medieval people were often those who could afford gentler versions, imported Castile soap from Spain, made with olive oil rather than tallow. This became a luxury product, and, naturally, royals loved it. Not because they used it often, but because it looked refined sitting on a shelf. Cleanliness as a visual illusion. The thing is, cleanliness in history was rarely about hygiene, it was about presentation. The cleanest person in the room wasn't necessarily the one who washed the most. It was the one who looked and smelled like they belonged above manual labor. White linen was key. It showed purity, wealth, and the absence of dirt. If you could afford to wear bright fabric that stayed unstained, people assumed you must be clean. Even portraits reinforced this illusion. Look at medieval and Renaissance paintings. Smooth, pale faces, spotless garments, shimmering fabrics. Not one hint of the fact that those people were probably unwashed and surrounded by lavender sachets to disguise the truth. Cleanliness was a costume, not a condition. The royal exception, Henry III of France. Every so often, though, a royal rebelled against the trend and actually liked bathing. Take Henry III of France. The man adored it. He had portable tubs, perfumes, sponges, and entire wardrobes of bath linens. He was known to bathe twice a day, a shocking indulgence in the 16th century. He even conducted council meetings from his bath, surrounded by scented oils and little dogs. Contemporaries were scandalized. They saw his bathing habits as frivolous and effeminate, but by modern standards, he was easily one of the cleanest men in Europe. It's always amusing how often the decadent monarchs end up sounding like the only ones who'd pass a basic hygiene test. When clean meant holy before soap was a social marker, it was a spiritual one. In the medieval Christian world, the body was considered secondary to the soul, so washing too much could be seen as vanity, caring more for flesh than for faith. Dutch saints and hermits were praised for their dirtiness. Their filth was proof of humility. Some even bragged about never bathing, as though grime itself was a sign of divine favor. One chronicler described a holy man whose skin fell away in flakes, revealing purity beneath, which is one way to describe what we'd now call a severe hygiene issue. Meanwhile, monks might bathe only on high holy days or when ill. Even then, communal baths were segregated by rank, abbots first, novices last. The result was a society where the cleanest people were often the most suspect, too polished, too perfumed, too worldly. The Renaissance, reversal by the late Renaissance, though. A few physicians began quietly suggesting that maybe, just maybe, clean water wasn't a tool of Satan. Washing the face and hands daily became fashionable again among elites. This wasn't full bathing, but it was progress. Queen Elizabeth the Mourn reportedly kept basins of water in her chamber and took a bath once a month, whether she needed it or not, which was probably a joke, but also not far off. Still, Elizabeth's court valued cleanliness as display. Her linen was immaculate, her hair carefully perfumed with rosemary and civet, her teeth cleaned with a paste of honey and burnt salt. She even had a special room for storing her dozens of gowns, each kept spotless by an army of laundresses. So, while she might not have been clean by modern standards, she embodied cleanliness to her contemporaries. It's all relative, really. The curious case of the Ottoman baths now. Not every civilization took this suspicious approach to soap. If you drifted eastward to the Islamic world, the Byzantine Empire, or the Ottoman court, you'd find a very different story. Public baths, or hammams, were integral to daily life. They were social, spiritual, and deeply practical. Cleanliness wasn't vanity. It was virtue. In fact, in the Islamic world, washing was and remains part of religious practice. Ritual ablutions before prayer, weekly full baths, scented oils afterward. Visitors from Europe often remarked, sometimes with envy, at how clean and fragrant Ottoman nobles were. One 16th-century ambassador complained that he felt positively unworthy beside them, which, given that he likely hadn't washed in months, was accurate. So if we're ranking historical cleanliness, the cleanest people in history weren't European royals at all. They were likely Ottoman courtiers and scholars, who bathed regularly, oiled their skin, and changed clothes frequently, because cleanliness was cultural, not cosmetic. Let's drift back to Europe. Meanwhile, back in Europe, things remained mixed. Even when soap-making improved in the 18th century, habits changed slowly. People still feared that hot water and open pores invited disease. Marie Antoinette, for example, bathed in porcelain tubs scented with orange blossom. But she did so in her private retreat, far from court eyes, because regular bathing was still considered a little suspicious and wasteful, and, frankly, too much effort. She did, however, change her clothes multiple times a day, fine linens, soft muslins, each layer freshly laundered and scented. Again, cleanliness as illusion. So while she was certainly among the cleanest people in her world, that world had a fairly low bar. It's worth remembering that dirt itself wasn't always seen as bad. Working people were expected to be dirty. It was evidence of labor, and thus honesty. For the wealthy, being clean meant being untouched by that kind of effort. They had servants for washing, maids for scrubbing, and perfumers for masking. The velvet illusion. Pretending to be noble in a world that loved. Pretending. Hey, everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a time when looking rich was almost as important as being rich. A time when silk sleeves, forged seals, and suspicious family trees could open doors that peasants were never meant to touch. Yes, tonight we're talking about how people faked nobility in the Middle Ages. So settle in, dim the lights, let the noise of the day melt away like candle wax. And let's float gently back to a Europe full of castles, heraldry, and a frankly absurd amount of lying. Because in a world obsessed with bloodlines, there were always a few creative souls who decided to, shall we say, edit theirs. The odd nature of medieval status. To begin, it's worth remembering that in the Middle Ages, identity was very fluid, but also very fixed. You were either born noble or you weren't. And if you weren't, the official expectation was that you'd stay that way forever. But of course, humans being humans, that didn't stop anyone from trying, because nobility wasn't just about land or money. It was about perception. Iter was the difference between sitting at the high table or serving at it, between wearing a sword by right or by wishful thinking. And the interesting thing is, medieval people were not particularly good at verifying who was who. There were no passports, no central databases, just gossip, reputation, and an occasional priest with a surprisingly bad memory. So, if you arrived in a new town wearing fine clothes, claimed descent from some half-forgotten knight, and could convincingly quote the Bible in Latin, well, congratulations. You were probably a noble now, at least until someone asked you to joust. The art of the heraldic lie heraldry, the colorful system of coats of arms, was supposed to help prevent confusion. In practice, it made things worse. By the 13th century, everyone who was anyone had a coat of arms. A lion here, a fleur-de-lis there, and maybe a nice intimidating bird clutching something symbolic. But these designs weren't centrally registered. Different families could use nearly identical arms, sometimes by coincidence, sometimes by coincidence. A clever man could simply invent a crest, claim it was ancient, and start stamping it on his belongings. And because heraldic design followed certain predictable rules, colors, animals, family symbols, it was surprisingly easy to make a fake one look legitimate. It's a bit like inventing your own university degree, but printing it on the right kind of paper. By the 14th century, the problem had become so common that actual heralds, royal officers in charge of keeping the system in order, started conducting what were known as visitations. They would travel around England, knocking on manor doors and politely asking people to prove they were noble. And if you couldn't, your coat of arms could be confiscated, which must have been an awkward conversation. "Good evening, sir. Lovely lion rampant you've got there. Now, would you mind explaining why you're claiming descent from a family that died out 3 generations ago?" The ambitious merchant, one of the most common impostors, wasn't some shadowy schemer, but the merchant. Because medieval merchants were rich, sometimes very rich, but still considered socially inferior. Money could buy fine clothes, but not respect, at least not officially. So what did they do? They leaned into performance. Wealthy trader might sponsor a local church window, showing his family arms, never. Mind that his father sold fish, or he might pay a chronicler to mention that his grandfather served gallantly in the Crusades. That phrase, served gallantly in the Crusades, was basically the medieval version of padding your resume, and, after a generation or two of consistent lying, something magical happened. People started to believe it, because the best way to fake nobility was not to do it yourself, but to have your grandchildren do it for you. The problem with paperwork forgery in the medieval sense was both surprisingly easy and technically complicated. Documents were handwritten, seals were made of wax, and record-keeping depended on clerks who were often overworked, underpaid, and illiterate in anything except Latin abbreviations. If you wanted to prove noble descent, you just needed to produce a charter, preferably one with a wax seal attached. That seal could be copied, or even stolen wax. Impressions were surprisingly portable. There are records from France and Burgundy of entire families fabricating ancient grants of nobility, sometimes going so far as to discover them in the walls of old monasteries. Nothing says authenticity quite like pretending you found your family's noble title behind a loose stone near an altar. Even kings occasionally fell for it. Charles VI of France, the one who thought he was made of glass, once confirmed a noble title that had been completely invented, and no one dared correct him because, well, he was the king. And also, he thought he was made of glass. The role of the church, as usual, was in the middle of it all. Clergy were often the record keepers, genealogists, and notaries of noble society. They copied family trees, authenticated documents, and occasionally looked the other way. A donation to the local monastery could do wonders for one's ancestry. If you gave the abbey enough land, the monks might start referring to your family as ancient patrons. After a few decades, that phrasing hardened into legend, then into genealogy, and finally into accepted truth. Some churchmen themselves took advantage of the confusion. There were cases of priests claiming to be from minor noble families, just to secure better benefices. Essentially, higher-paying church positions. It was, in essence, a world where everyone was pretending to be slightly more important than they really were. A tradition that, one might argue, has not entirely disappeared. Let's drift over to Italy. In Italy, where city-states like Florence and Venice were built on trade, the line between nobility and wealth blurred early. There, merchants didn't just fake nobility, they bought it. Venice had a ruling class called the patriciate, whose members were recorded in something rather dramatically called the Golden Book. Entry to this book was supposed to be hereditary. But during financial crises, the Republic quietly opened the door to new members for a fee. Essentially, if you had enough money, you could become an ancient family overnight. Elsewhere in Italy, families like the Medici, who began as bankers, perfected the art of rewriting their past. By the time they produced popes and queens, everyone politely pretended that their ancient lineage stretched back to Roman times, which, of course, it didn't. But no one really wanted to bring it up. The self-made knight in Northern Europe, particularly England and Germany, knighthood was another easy pathway for fakers. While originally a purely military title, by the late Middle Ages it had become partly ceremonial and occasionally purchasable. A man could be dubbed a knight for service, or in some cases simply for making a large enough donation to the right noble cause. So, ambitious men began to present themselves as knights long before anyone had actually knighted them. The trick was confidence and armor. If you showed up in plate armor, on a horse, calling yourself Sir, most people weren't going to argue. There are even legal records of imposter knights being fined for using titles they hadn't earned. But in many cases, it worked, and once again, the longer the lie lasted, the truer it became. A son born to an imposter knight might grow up genuinely believing he was of noble blood. And by the time anyone tried to dispute it, it was easier for everyone to just accept the story. History is, after all, full of lies that simply got old enough to sound respectable. The case of the fake crusader. Families by the 15th century, having crusader ancestors, was the gold standard of nobility. It didn't matter which crusade, or even if your supposed ancestor ever made it past Venice. The key thing was that he tried. So families across Europe began to quietly insert Sir Geoffrey, who went to the Holy Land, into their genealogies. No records needed. Just a vague story about valor and sand. Some families went even further. They forged entire family trees, tracing back to knights who allegedly fought under Richard the Lionheart. One French family claimed descent from a man who had rescued the true cross, which, if true, would have made them quite famous. It wasn't, but it did make them sound impressive. And that was really the point. The soft power of pretending. It's easy to laugh at all this, at the idea of men sitting by candlelight, drawing lions on their shields and pretending to have famous grandfathers. But the social pressure was real. In medieval Europe, nobility meant access to legal privileges, to positions at court, to better marriages. Being noble wasn't just about ego. It was about survival in a rigid hierarchy. So when someone faked a title, they weren't necessarily being ridiculous. They were just trying to climb a ladder that was nailed to the wall. And for some, it worked beautifully. Let's drift toward France again. By the early 1400s, the French royal administration was swamped with petitions from families seeking official recognition of their ancient nobility. It became a bureaucratic nightmare. Whole offices were devoted to verifying claims and, of course, accepting generous fees for the service. Some families passed inspection, but almost everyone tried. It's rather comforting. In a way, even in the height of medieval hierarchy, everyone was suffering from imposter syndrome. Between blades, the lonely, quiet lives of medieval executioners tonight. We're drifting back to a time when justice wore a hood, when the clang of iron in a city square meant that someone, somewhere, had made a very bad decision, and someone else was about to make a living from it. Yes, tonight we're talking about executioners, but not the bloody part. We're looking at what happened after the scaffold was taken down, when the sword was polished and put away, when there were no heads to remove, no gallows to build, and no crowd to cheer. What did these people, these necessary outcasts, do all day when business was slow? So, go ahead, settle in, dim the lights, maybe pull the blanket a little higher. Because we're wandering now into the quieter corners of medieval justice, the strange, awkward world of the professional executioner at rest, the job no one wanted, but someone had to do first. Let's gently remind ourselves that being an executioner was never a career goal. No child in 14th century Europe ever looked up from their bowl of gruel and said, "When I grow up, I want to decapitate tax evaders." It was a job people usually inherited, were forced into, or accepted as a last resort. Sometimes, convicted criminals were offered a grim bargain. Take up the sword, or feel it. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't noble, and it certainly wasn't social. Executioners existed in a peculiar limbo. They were technically respected for enforcing the law, but also shunned for doing it. People needed them, but didn't want to shake their hands. The life between sentences. So what happened when the court was quiet, when no one was being condemned, and the scaffold gathered dust? Well, they got bored, terribly, awkwardly bored. Executions weren't daily events. In most towns, they were rare, maybe a few times a year, depending on crime and population size, so the rest of the time, executioners needed to find ways to earn a living. And, surprisingly, they did. Because, as it turns out, the medieval world found all sorts of grimly practical uses for a man who wasn't squeamish. 16. The other jobs of the executioner. Let's start with the most common one, animal control. Executioners were often paid to kill stray dogs or diseased livestock. Yes, they were the medieval equivalent of pest control. In some towns, they even managed kennels or handled wild animals brought in for punishment. And yes, that was a thing. Animals were occasionally put on trial for crimes. Pigs, cows, goats. Because of course they were. When the sentence came down, someone had to carry it out. That someone was, naturally, the executioner. It was grim, repetitive work, but it was steady. The cleaner of human messes executioners also cleaned up after people. Not in a helpful way. More in a please remove this human body from the street way. They disposed of corpses after battles, plagues, or executions. Sometimes they handled suicides. People denied Christian burial because of the nature of their death. It was the executioner's job to drag those bodies outside city walls and bury them quietly. Away from consecrated ground, he was, in short, medieval sanitation with a sword. 15th century record from Germany even lists an executioner being paid a small bonus for scraping dried blood from the platform. It was a living. A trade in death and medicine, but here's where it gets stranger. Daughter. Executioners, often doubled as healers. Yes, the same man who swung the axe might also set your broken leg, or sell you a cure for gout. This wasn't as contradictory as it sounds. Executioners had access to, let's say, unique materials, things that doctors, or rather, medieval equivalents of doctors, believed had healing powers. For example, The fat of an executed man was thought to treat joint pain. His blood might cure epilepsy. Even his rope, the one that ended his life, was considered a good luck charm against disease. Executioners collected these leftovers and sold them discreetly. In some places, they even ran small apothecaries. So when there were no executions, they became medical entrepreneurs. You could walk into their house, point to your bad back, and leave with a jar of ointment that was, unfortunately, human-based naturally. Most people didn't want to see where it came from. The paradox of the hangman healer. It's worth pausing to appreciate the irony. Executioners were officially shunned, barred from churches, from guilds, and often from public gatherings, yet people lined up at their doors. When they were sick, chronicler from Nuremberg in the 1500s describes townsfolk sneaking to the executioner's home at night to buy miracle salves, and these men often developed genuine skill. They were accustomed to anatomy, wounds, and blood loss, so while they weren't educated physicians, they had practical experience that other healers lacked. One of the most famous examples was Franz Schmidt, the executioner of Nuremberg in the late 16th century. He kept meticulous journals of every execution he performed, over 300 of them, but also of his medical work. He treated hundreds of patients, dislocated shoulders, burns, boils, fractures, you name it, and many of them survived. By the time of his retirement, Schmidt was better known for his healing than his killing. He even received a letter of nobility from the emperor. It's a strange, comforting thought that the man who once ended lives spent his later years saving them. The awkward position of the executioner's family. Between jobs, an executioner's family lived in a kind of social quarantine. They weren't allowed to marry respectable citizens. Their children couldn't easily find apprenticeships or work outside their father's trade. In many cases, the role became hereditary, not because it was desirable, but because no one else would marry into the family. So entire dynasties of executioners appeared. Fathers, sons, grandsons, all handling the same grim tasks for generations. They lived on the edge of town, often literally. Their houses were built near gallows hills or outside the city walls, which must have made for a fairly bleak commute. But within those small circles, they developed tight communities. They married the daughters of other executioners, shared trade secrets, and sometimes passed along detailed manuals on how to perform executions cleanly. There are surviving notes from a 16th-century German hangman advising apprentices to strike with calmness, not haste. Sage advice for any line of work. Really, the economy of the scaffold. You might think an executioner was well paid, considering the nerves of steel required. In reality, not so much. Most were paid per job. A beheading might earn a few coins, a hanging a bit less. More complex tasks, like breaking someone on the wheel, came with small bonuses. Between those jobs, executioners relied on odd work: cleaning, animal disposal, or collecting tolls at city gates. Some even operated taverns or bathhouses, though patrons often avoided them unless particularly thirsty or unbothered by superstition. Still, the scaffold business could occasionally be profitable. In some towns, executioners were allowed to keep the clothing or personal belongings of the condemned, which led to a rather morbid form of recycling. It's possible that somewhere in 15th century Bavaria, someone wore a rather nice coat, without realizing its previous owner had not died of natural causes. The social ritual of avoidance. When there were no executions, there was still one constant: avoidance. People wouldn't sit near executioners in church. They wouldn't share meals. They wouldn't drink from the same cups. Executioners and their families might have their own pews, or be made to attend Mass last. In some regions, priests refused to offer them communion. Yet those same priests would bless the gallows before a hanging, ensuring the condemned's soul a cleaner passage. It was an odd hypocrisy. The church needed the hangman, but preferred not to look at him. So executioners spent much of their off time in solitude. They fished, hunted, or drank quietly at home. Records show some owned small gardens or kept bees. Simple, quiet hobbies to fill the hours between the grim necessities of their work. There's something almost peaceful about that image. The hangman tending to his vegetables, waiting for the next name to arrive. The festivals and the public face. But when festival days rolled around, the executioner was sometimes back in public, strangely enough, as a celebrity. In German-speaking lands, he might appear in processions, dressed in bright clothes, symbolizing the town's justice. He wasn't exactly celebrated, but tolerated. Like an unsettling mascot, occasionally, towns even employed executioners as entertainers. They could perform tricks, show feats of strength, or, ironically, judge contests of fencing and swordsmanship. After all, who better to decide whether someone's swing was clean? But once the parade ended, the social walls went right back up. In Eastern Europe, executioners often had broader powers. They acted as constables, jailers, and even interrogators. When they weren't executing, they were maintaining order. In some towns, they were responsible for enforcing curfews or punishing minor offenders, public whippings, brandings, or pillory duties. So, when there were no capital crimes, they simply managed lesser punishments. They were always around. but that came with its own loneliness. You can't really make small talk when everyone crosses the street to avoid you. Imagine walking through a market and watching people pull their children closer, not because you've done something wrong, but because you've done your job too well. The private world behind closed doors, they read. Or, more accurately, those who could read did. Some executioners were surprisingly literate. The Hangman's Quiet House. Hey, everyone, tonight, we're drifting back to a world that doesn't smell like antiseptic or paperwork. A world of wood smoke, damp straw, and a faint metallic tang in the air. Tonight, we're talking about the medieval executioner. Now, I know, not exactly a relaxing topic, is it? But bear with me. This isn't about the blood, or the blades, or the grisly details. It's about the people, the awkward, lonely, sometimes surprisingly tender people whose job it was to end lives, professionally, efficiently, and without ever being fully forgiven for it. So, settle in, dim the lights, let your mind slow down, and imagine the distant echo of a church bell rolling across a medieval town square. Because somewhere nearby, in a small, slightly crooked house at the edge of the wall, there's a man sharpening a sword, not for battle, not for sport, but for work. He's not a villain, he's not a sadist, he's the municipal hangman, and that, in medieval Europe, was a deeply confusing social position. Executioners were essential. Towns needed them. Somebody had to do the dirty work of justice. But that same necessity made them unclean. They were paid by the city, protected by the law, but treated by everyone else like human contagion. Imagine being the person everyone avoids at the market, but who also happens to hold the keys to the jail, the rack, and the gallows. It's an odd sort of power, and an even odder kind of loneliness. Let's start in the German-speaking world, because no one documented civic bureaucracy and moral discomfort quite like medieval Germans. By the 14th century, almost every major city had a designated executioner, or Scharfrichter, literally sharp judge, which sounds both impressive and mildly terrifying. He was responsible not only for beheadings, hangings, and wheelings, a particularly unpleasant German innovation, but also for what were politely called dishonorable trades. He disposed of animal carcasses. He cleaned cesspits. He flogged criminals, inspected brothels, and handled suicides, bodies that the church refused to bury. Basically, he was the human mop of urban morality. If something or someone was considered impure, it landed in his hands. Because of this, the executioner occupied a strange legal category. He wasn't a criminal. Technically, he was law enforcement. But he wasn't fully a citizen either. He couldn't hold public office, join a guild, or take communion with the rest of the congregation. Most people refused to shake his hand. Some refused to make eye contact. Children were warned not to play near his house. And yet, when a crime was committed, everyone suddenly remembered his address. Now, this creates an interesting sociological question. What kind of person becomes an executioner? Well, usually, someone who didn't have much of a choice. Cities often recruited executioners from condemned criminals. The logic went something like, "You're good with knives, you've already broken a few laws, why not put those skills to civic use?" In some cases, a man could literally save his own neck by agreeing to chop off others. If the first attempt went well, the town might even keep him on permanently. Congratulations, you're now the hangman. Here's your house, your sword, and a lifetime of social exile. But over time, execution became a family business, a grim little dynasty. The Franz Schmidt family in Nuremberg, for instance, produced multiple generations of professional executioners. Franz himself, who worked in the late 16th century, kept an extraordinary diary. It's surprisingly clinical, almost soothingly bureaucratic. He recorded every execution he ever performed, 394 in total. Each entry is brief, factual, and written in a tone you might use to describe bookkeeping. He notes, Tuesday beheaded a thief. Wednesday, hanged 2 highwaymen. Friday, broke a murderer on the wheel. There's no gore, no moral reflection, just duty. And yet, tucked among the entries are glimpses of humanity. How he pardoned one man who repented, or how he prayed for another before lifting the sword. For all his grim efficiency, Franz saw himself not as a monster, but as a servant of justice, which raises the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this topic. Executioners often believed they were doing good. They weren't punishing people. They were cleaning the moral fabric of the world. Still, it's hard to feel entirely righteous when everyone treats you like plague on legs. Executioners lived on the outskirts of town, both literally and socially. Their houses were usually near the gallows, or by the leper colony, or downwind of both. Medieval zoning was nothing if not symbolic. And while they earned good money, sometimes more than a city judge, they couldn't spend it anywhere pleasant. Inns would refuse them. Priests would turn them away. If they tried to buy bread at a regular market, the baker might burn the leftover crumbs as contaminated. So, most hangmen developed their own shadow economies. They married within their own families. Other executioners, knackers, or gravediggers. Their children often apprenticed into the same trade. Because no one else would employ them, over time, this created a sort of executioner caste, legally tolerated, socially cursed, and economically self-sufficient. It's tragic, really. a whole community of people doomed to clean up everyone else's sins, and then blamed for the smell. But here's the twist. Some of them were popular. Yes, really, the hangman might be feared on Monday, shunned on Tuesday, and quietly visited on Wednesday, because he was also the town's most experienced healer. You see, the line between anatomy and execution was surprisingly thin. Hangmen knew where tendons, bones, and arteries were, often in more detail than the local doctors, so people began coming to them with sprains, broken limbs, and infections, and the executioners, being practical men, didn't mind helping. They were used to handling flesh, after all. Franz Schmidt himself treated hundreds of patients for free. He even had a city license to practice medicine. The same man who decapitated criminals by day reset dislocated shoulders by night. It's an oddly poetic symmetry. The hand that destroys and the hand that heals, belonging to the same person. Still, the duality took its toll. Imagine living in a small medieval town where everyone knows you as the man who kills people on Thursdays. Every knock on the door might be a condemned prisoner, or a desperate patient, or an angry neighbor complaining about the smell of the gallows. You were part of society, but not in it. The line between work and life didn't exist, because work was your life. Some hangmen tried to wash away the stigma by becoming excessively moral, attending church, donating to charity, insisting they were God's instruments. Others leaned into the role. They drank heavily, joked morbidly, and cultivated reputations for toughness. But in the end, most seem to have been quiet men, meticulous, isolated, resigned. They couldn't afford hatred, or pride, or mistakes. An execution had to be clean, efficient, and merciful, or the crowd might turn on them, because nothing was more dangerous than a botched death in front of an angry medieval audience. The crowd, by the way, was half the point. Executions weren't private affairs. They were civic theater, the moral equivalent of a medieval Netflix special, except with more mud and fewer disclaimers. Everyone turned up. Merchants, beggars, children, dogs. They bought snacks, cheered, booed, and occasionally pelted the condemned with rotten vegetables. And at the center of it all stood the executioner, both star and scapegoat. If the death was swift, people applauded his skill. If it wasn't, they screamed for his head. Imagine that kind of performance anxiety, knowing that your reputation, and possibly your life, depended on how steady your hands were after 5 hours of public shouting. Some executioners practiced obsessively. They trained with dummies. They measured necks. They sharpened blades to a degree of near-religious precision, because to them, a clean execution wasn't just technique. It was moral hygiene. And then When the crowd dispersed and the body was buried, the hangman went home, back to the little house by the city wall. Maybe he sat by the fire, poured a cup of beer, and tried to ignore the faint smell of iron on his clothes. Maybe his children were asleep. Maybe his wife was mending a shirt. And for a few quiet minutes, he was just a man, tired, thoughtful, perhaps wondering what kind of life this was, this strange half-existence between necessity and disgust. Because every city needed a hangman, and every hangman needed forgiveness. But neither quite knew how to get it. Let's drift now, gently, from the small-town gallows of Germany to the grander, more self-conscious spectacles of France and England. Because royal justice had its own style, complete with velvet robes, ceremonial axes, and professional decapitators who could, quite literally, make or break a monarch's public image. And, of course, there's a story about one of them, a quiet, melancholy man who executed queens for a living, and who never really recovered from it. Now, before we drift to the next part of our journey, into monasteries, royal courts, and plague pits, it's worth pausing on one small, comforting truth. For all their odd ideas about bathing, medieval people did crave cleanliness. They wanted to feel fresh, to smell good, to be civilized. They just lived in a world that made that almost impossible. And so they did what humans always do. They improvised. They found beauty in small rituals. They turned washing into ceremony, scent into status, and filth into something almost poetic, the silent power behind the throne. Hey, everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a world where the most powerful men in an empire weren't technically men at all, so settle in, dim the lights, get comfortable. Let your brain slow down to that pleasantly fuzzy nighttime rhythm, and let's talk about the eunuchs who ran the world. It's not exactly a cheerful bedtime story, but it's an oddly soothing one. A tale of soft voices, silk robes, and silent corridors where decisions that shaped empires were whispered by people who, technically, weren't supposed to exist. Because the eunuch, that strange hybrid of trusted servant, political operator, and human sacrifice, was one of history's most peculiar power brokers. He wasn't supposed to have ambition. He wasn't supposed to have a family. And yet, somehow he ended up running empires, commanding armies, and quietly outliving the kings he served. It's the sort of paradox that history specializes in. Let's start where most power stories begin, in the ancient Near East, sometime around the 8th century BCE. Back then, the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians were building the first great bureaucratic machines. And those machines needed gears that wouldn't rebel. You see, early kings had a problem. If you surrounded yourself with noblemen, they might get ideas, dangerous ones, Like, I could run this place better. If you surrounded yourself with slaves, they might run away. So someone, somewhere, perhaps a royal advisor with an exceptionally dark sense of humor, suggested the perfect solution. Find a servant who couldn't start a dynasty. And thus, the eunuch was born, quite literally, through the kind of surgery best not imagined in detail. The logic was gruesomely practical. A eunuch couldn't produce heirs. He couldn't marry into powerful families. His loyalty, therefore, could belong only to the king. It was an awful, ingenious idea, and naturally, it worked far better than anyone expected. By the time of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the one run by Cyrus the Great, and later by Darius, eunuchs had become a cornerstone of royal administration. They guarded the harem. They handled private correspondence. They even managed the imperial treasury. Because who else could you trust with the money, if not someone who couldn't exactly retire to a family estate and start a coup? Herodotus, the ever-gossipy Greek historian, tells us that many Persian eunuchs were immensely powerful. Some even commanded armies. They weren't just silent attendants with feather fans. They were diplomats, spies, and enforcers. One of the most famous was Bagoas, who served under Darius III and later, rather awkwardly, under Alexander the Great. After Darius's unfortunate demise, Bagoas was, by all accounts, extremely charming, dangerously intelligent, and possibly Alexander's lover. Alexander rewarded him with gold and titles, and he appears in ancient sources as one of the few people who could speak freely to the conqueror of the known world, which says quite a bit about his influence. In other words, while the Persian kings were busy conquering nations, it was often eunuchs like Bagoas who quietly kept the empire from collapsing under its own weight. And this, curiously enough, became the template for centuries to come. The idea that a ruler, absolute in theory, distracted in practice, needed someone utterly loyal, thoroughly castrated, and inconveniently indispensable. Let's drift forward a few centuries. Rome had its share of eunuchs too, though they tended to appear more in the shadows. Slaves and singers, attendants and whisperers around imperial wives. But the real age of the eunuch begins in earnest with the Byzantine Empire. That glittering, paranoid continuation of Rome that somehow survived for 1,000 years by sheer bureaucratic spite. If Rome was a republic that decayed into autocracy, Byzantium was an autocracy that survived by turning paranoia into an art form. And who better to trust in such an atmosphere than a man who couldn't pass on your secrets to his sons? Because he didn't have any? The Byzantine court was a hive of titles so elaborate they required a glossary, but among them a few glitter with peculiar power, titles reserved for eunuchs. There was the parakoimomenos, literally the one who sleeps beside, not in the romantic sense, but because he guarded the emperor's bedchamber. There was also the protovestiarios, who oversaw the imperial wardrobe and treasury, a very delicate balance of silks and silver. Some eunuchs became generals, some became patriarchs of the church, and some became kingmakers. One of the most notorious was Joseph Bringas, who in the 10th century effectively ruled the empire, while Emperor Romanos II occupied himself with hunting, drinking, and the usual imperial hobbies, such as dying young. Bringas was both feared and resented, which was quite an achievement for someone officially categorized as safe. Byzantine chroniclers loved to complain about eunuchs. They called them schemers, flatterers, manipulators. They also, somewhat grudgingly, admitted that they were often the only ones capable of actually running things. This was because eunuchs had the one trait most courtiers lacked: longevity. They didn't marry, didn't get distracted by children or alliances, and didn't retire to their estates. They served for life. Imagine a bureaucrat who starts working for one emperor as a young man, and then continues, calmly, efficiently, through 3 palace coups, 2 assassinations, and 1 theological schism. By the end, he's the only person who remembers how anything actually works. That was the Byzantine eunuch, unkillable by gossip, unshakable by scandal, quietly indispensable. It didn't hurt that some emperors, like Constantine VII, were suspicious of anyone who wasn't surgically disqualified from treason. Eunuchs filled the palace corridors like so many loyal ghosts, drifting from office to office with keys, ledgers, and perhaps a touch of smug superiority. Now, it's tempting to imagine these men as tragic figures, stripped of normal human joys, condemned to servitude, and, to be fair, many were victims of cruelty, taken as boys, and altered for the sake of other men's comfort. But some learned to make an art of power. They couldn't inherit, so they collected influence. They couldn't father children, so they cultivated protégés, and, in a way, that made them the perfect imperial functionaries, people who saw the system clearly, without the distractions of dynasty. One Byzantine writer even suggested, with biting irony, that eunuchs made better Christians, since they were free from worldly temptations, which, frankly, sounds like something a eunuch might have written himself, while approving a new tax policy. Of course, the phenomenon wasn't confined to Europe. Far from it. If Byzantium turned eunuch politics into theater, China turned it into an institution. The Chinese imperial court had eunuchs from the very beginning, as early as the Zhou dynasty. But under the Ming and Qing dynasties, the eunuch bureaucracy became almost a parallel government. At their peak, there were tens of thousands of them inside the Forbidden City. They polished the floors, trimmed the lamps, guarded the concubines, managed the paperwork, supervised the kitchen, counted the treasury, ran the palace post office, and occasionally, when the emperor was lazy or suspicious or drunk, ran the entire empire. One might say the Forbidden City ran on eunuch labor, and more than once it ran into eunuch rule. Perhaps the most famous of them all was Zheng He, the great admiral of the early 15th century, a Muslim-born eunuch from Yunnan who rose to command the largest fleet the world had ever seen. 7 voyages, hundreds of ships, thousands of men. He sailed as far as India, Arabia, and East Africa, spreading Chinese prestige and collecting an alarming number of giraffes. And through it all, he remained loyal to the Yongle emperor, who trusted him precisely because he had no personal ambitions beyond service. Of course, after both men died, the Confucian bureaucrats, who despised eunuchs on principle, cancelled his voyages, burned the records, and declared the whole thing a waste of time, which was, perhaps, the most predictable ending imaginable. Chinese history is filled with stories of eunuchs rising high and falling, harder. One era's indispensable administrator was the next era's scapegoat for corruption. For every Zheng He, there was a Wei Zhongxian, the infamous Ming eunuch who controlled the emperor, silenced dissent, and ran an effective dictatorship from behind silk screens. He was eventually forced to commit suicide, but not before his name became a byword for corruption and fear. It's a recurring pattern across cultures. When things go well, eunuchs are discreet servants. When things go badly, they're suddenly blamed for everything. It's almost as if rulers needed someone to embody the sins of the system. Someone human enough to despise, yet inhuman enough to disown. And, well, eunuchs fit the role perfectly. But behind the grand politics, there's something quietly poignant about them. Many were taken as boys from poor families, sometimes sold by desperate parents, sometimes captured in war, sometimes punished for crimes, and yet, in those same palaces, some found strange forms of power, companionship, even affection. They built networks of friendship. They adopted heirs, not by blood, but by loyalty. They decorated their quarters with poetry, art, and incense. Their world was one of ritual and secrecy, but also of quiet dignity. If you picture them as lonely figures haunting marble corridors, you wouldn't be wrong, but you'd also be missing the resilience that kept them there, year after year, outlasting emperors and dynasties alike.